The first patient arrived 3 minutes before Franklin Family Dental officially reopened. Ivy watched the elderly man step out of his car with one hand pressed against his jaw and couldn't stop smiling. She had imagined this moment for 18 years. Before she reached him, another man in a black suit crossed the parking lot and stopped directly in front of the patient. He spoke calmly, almost politely. "I'm sorry, sir. This clinic is closed today." The elderly man frowned and looked toward Ivy. She stood frozen beneath the blue ribbon stretched across the entrance. "There must be some mistake," she said as she walked over. The man turned to face her for the first time. He opened his briefcase, took out a sealed envelope, and placed it in her hands. "No mistake, Miss Ivy. My employer asked me to deliver this before you treated your first patient." Ivy didn't reach for the envelope. She looked past the man in the black suit and smiled at the elderly patient instead. The appointment card was still in his hand. She remembered writing his name at the top of her schedule herself. He had been the first person to call after Franklin Family Dental announced it was reopening. Ivy walked toward him. Before she reached the sidewalk, the man in the suit quietly handed the patient a single sheet of paper. The old man lowered his eyes. Another appointment. Another clinic. Same morning. Same time. Every fee had already been paid. A black sedan rolled into the parking lot as if it had been waiting for that moment. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Nobody rushed. Nobody argued. Everything had already been arranged. The old man looked at Ivy for several long seconds. The pain in his jaw finally made the decision for him. "I'm sorry." It was the only thing he said before walking toward the waiting car. Ivy didn't stop him. She couldn't. Asking him to stay meant asking him to spend another day in pain for a fight he knew nothing about. She watched the sedan disappear onto the street. The ribbon was still hanging across the front entrance. The welcome flowers were still standing where she had placed them before sunrise. Inside the clinic, the first chair was still empty. Only then did Ivy lower her eyes to the envelope resting quietly in her hand. The black sedans were already gone by the time the street returned to its normal rhythm. Cars continued passing Franklin Family Dental without slowing down. A city bus stopped at the corner. 2 construction workers crossed the intersection carrying coffee. Across the street, an elderly couple paused long enough to look at the freshly painted sign before continuing their morning walk. To everyone outside, it looked like the opening day of another neighborhood dental clinic. Nobody knew the first patient had already left before the ribbon had even been cut. The envelope remained in Ivy's hand. It was heavier than she expected. The paper inside had been folded carefully, leaving sharp creases that suggested it had been prepared long before this morning. There was no company logo on the front, no law firm's name, no return address, only one word: Ivy. She broke the seal and unfolded the first page. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a government notice. It was a single sentence. Franklin Family Dental should have remained closed 18 years ago. It will remain closed today. Ivy read it twice before turning the page. The second sheet was an appraisal report. Every treatment room appeared on the list. Every dental chair, every x-ray unit, every compressor, every square foot of land beneath the building. Whoever prepared the report had walked through this clinic before. At the bottom sat a number large enough to make most people stop reading: $2,300,000. The last page contained only one sentence: name your bank. The transfer can be completed before noon. A single handwritten signature rested beneath it: Grant. Ivy folded the papers back into the envelope. She looked toward the sidewalk where the man in the black suit was still waiting. He hadn't moved since the first patient left. "My employer believes this is a fair offer," he said. His voice carried no pressure, no threat. It sounded more like someone discussing the weather than the future of a family business. Ivy looked past him toward the clinic entrance. The blue ribbon still stretched across the doorway. Denise had tied the bow herself before sunrise because Franklin always said a reopening deserved the same care as a grand opening. The brass letters above the entrance caught the morning sun exactly the way they had in old family photographs. 18 years had changed almost everything around that building. They hadn't changed its name. Ivy slid the papers back into the envelope and held them out. "Tell your employer something for me." The man accepted the envelope without speaking. This building stopped being for sale 18 years ago. For the first time that morning, the man hesitated. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. Then he reached into his jacket and placed a plain white business card on the reception counter just inside the entrance. No company, no address, no name, only a phone number. "Keep it," he said quietly. "You'll know when to use it." He turned. stepped into the waiting sedan, and closed the door. A few seconds later, both black cars disappeared around the corner. The parking lot became quiet again. Then another engine pulled in. Another SUV rolled into the parking lot less than a minute after the black sedans disappeared. It slowed as it passed the reopening banner before stopping in front of the entrance. A young woman climbed out first, then opened the rear door for a little boy holding one side of his face. He kept his mouth slightly open, breathing carefully as though even closing his jaw would make the pain worse. The child couldn't have been older than 8. His mother carried a clear plastic folder stuffed with dental records, insurance forms, and handwritten notes. The corners of the folder were worn from being opened too many times. She had probably spent the past few days calling every dental office she could find before someone finally gave her an appointment here. The little boy stopped walking as soon as he saw the painted fish covering the front window. He stared at them for several seconds without smiling. Pain had a way of stealing a child's curiosity before anything else. Ivy stepped forward and welcomed them inside. The woman thanked her for fitting them into the schedule on such short notice. Before either of them reached the front door, a phone began vibrating inside the woman's purse. She glanced at the screen, apologized softly, and answered the call. Ivy couldn't hear the voice on the other end. She didn't need to. The woman's face told the story one expression at a time. First came confusion, then hesitation, finally, embarrassment. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When it ended, she remained standing exactly where she was, holding the phone without putting it away. She looked toward the clinic entrance, then toward her son, then back at Ivy. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "They've already arranged another appointment for him." That was all she said. She never explained who they were. She never asked another question. She simply reached for her son's hand and walked him back toward the SUV. The little boy looked over his shoulder once before climbing inside. He looked at the colorful fish again, then rested his head against the window as the vehicle slowly pulled away. Ivy stood beside the entrance until the SUV disappeared into morning traffic. 2 patients had arrived. 2 patients had left. The first treatment chair inside Franklin Family Dental was still empty. The reception clock showed 8:27 when Denise walked through the front door carrying a tray of coffee for the staff. She stopped after taking only a few steps. The waiting room was silent. Every chair remained empty. The appointment book on the reception desk still showed 2 checked-in patients, yet no one was sitting there waiting to be called. Denise slowly placed the coffee on the counter and looked toward Ivy. She didn't ask what had happened. She simply noticed the unopened registration forms still lying exactly where Ivy had left them. Did they cancel? Ivy shook her head once. That was enough. Denise had spent more than 20 years working beside Franklin. She knew the difference between patients who canceled and patients who never had the chance to become patients. Another phone rang. This time it came from the reception desk. Ivy answered before the second ring. A woman on the other end apologized for missing her appointment. She explained that another clinic had called earlier that morning, saying Franklin Family Dental was unable to accept patients because of an unexpected licensing issue. They had already scheduled her husband somewhere else. Before Ivy could respond, the caller thanked her for understanding and ended the call. The phone rang again less than 30 seconds later. Then again. Different voices, different families. The same explanation every time. Someone had contacted them first. Someone already knew every appointment on Ivy's schedule. Denise quietly pulled the appointment book closer and turned the pages one by one. Every name Franklin Family Dental expected to see that morning was still there. Every phone number was correct. Every appointment had been confirmed the day before. Yet one by one, they were disappearing before anyone reached the front door. Ivy slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out the plain white business card Cedric had left behind. The single phone number printed across the center no longer looked like a bluff. It looked like someone had expected this exact moment before sunrise. 4 names were still written across the morning schedule. By 10 o'clock, every appointment box beside them had been crossed out in red ink. None of the patients had called the clinic themselves. Every cancellation came after someone else had already spoken to them first. Ivy placed the appointment book flat on the reception desk and slowly compared it with the call log from the previous evening. Denise had personally confirmed every patient before closing the clinic. Nothing had changed overnight except one thing. Someone had reached all of them before they arrived. Denise quietly picked up the first patient file and looked through the emergency contact form, then the second, then the third. Every record was complete. Addresses, insurance numbers, phone numbers, medical history. Everything a dental clinic normally kept. How could anyone know all of this? Denise asked softly, almost to herself. Ivy didn't answer. She was already thinking about something else. The people who canceled weren't simply told to stay away. They had been given appointments somewhere else. That meant whoever was behind this operation wasn't trying to scare patients. They were replacing Franklin Family Dental before it even had the chance to exist again. Ivy picked up the white business card Cedric had left behind, turned it over once, then placed it back on the counter. Calling that number now would only prove one thing. Grant had guessed exactly how long it would take before she started doubting herself. She wasn't ready to give him that satisfaction. Just then, the reception bell chimed. Both Ivy and Denise looked up at the same time. A middle-aged man stood quietly inside the entrance, holding an X-ray envelope beneath his arm. Neither woman had heard his car arrive. The man looked around the reception area before taking a slow step toward the counter. His gray jacket had faded from years of use, and the X-ray envelope he carried had been folded so many times that the edges had turned white. He didn't check in. He didn't ask for an appointment. His eyes stayed fixed on the photographs hanging along the wall behind Ivy. Most of them showed Franklin standing beside former patients after complicated surgeries. One picture, taken nearly 20 years earlier, held his attention longer than the others. Ivy noticed it immediately. "Can I help you?" The man looked away from the photograph as though someone had interrupted a memory. "I hope so." His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had rehearsed those words many times before saying them aloud. He placed the old X-ray envelope on the counter without opening it. "I heard this clinic reopened today," Ivy nodded. "It did." The man gave a faint smile. "Then I guess I finally came back at the right time." Denise stepped closer, studying his face for a moment. Something about him felt strangely familiar, although she couldn't explain why. The man slowly turned back toward Franklin's photograph. "He probably wouldn't remember me," he said, "but I've never forgotten him." Ivy followed his eyes to the picture. It was one of the last photographs taken before Franklin closed the clinic 18 years earlier. "Did you know my father?" she asked. The man remained silent for several seconds before giving a small nod. Better than he ever realized, he gently pushed the old X-ray envelope toward Ivy. Everything that happened 18 years ago began with what's inside. Raymond didn't ask for a chair. He remained standing beside the reception counter while Ivy unfolded the old envelope one more time. The X-ray film inside had faded over the years, but the image itself remained surprisingly clear. A lower wisdom tooth lay almost sideways beneath the gum. Its roots curved toward a narrow white canal running through the jawbone. Ivy carried the film to the viewing panel Franklin had installed years before. The old light box still worked. A soft click echoed through the quiet clinic as the image illuminated the room. Denise walked over without saying a word. Neither woman needed to explain what they were seeing. The roots sat dangerously close to the inferior alveolar nerve. Even after 18 years, the warning was obvious. Ivy lowered her eyes to the corner of the film. Franklin's handwriting covered the margin. Short measurements, small arrows, 2 circles around the nerve canal. One final note written more firmly than the others: refer for specialist evaluation. She had seen that handwriting all her life. Franklin never wrote more than necessary inside a patient's chart. Every word had a purpose. Every mark answered a question. Ivy studied the notes again, trying to imagine her father standing in this same room with the same film in his hands. She could almost picture him tracing the roots with a pencil before looking back at the patient. Raymond finally broke the silence. He looked at that film for a long time. His voice remained calm. Then he handed it back. Nothing more. No explanation, no accusation, only one memory. Ivy looked at the X-ray once again. The film didn't tell her what happened after that day. It only told her one thing with complete certainty. Franklin had seen the danger before anyone touched the tooth. Raymond reached into the envelope again, this time removing something thinner than the X-ray. It was an old newspaper clipping folded into quarters. Time had turned the paper yellow, and one edge had almost separated from the rest. He placed it gently beside the illuminated film without opening it himself. Ivy unfolded the clipping with both hands. The article wasn't long. Most of the page was occupied by a smiling photograph of a young woman wearing a graduation gown. She looked healthy, happy, too young for anyone to expect her picture to appear in a newspaper for that reason. The headline stopped Ivy before she reached the first paragraph. Young woman dies following dental procedure. She continued reading in silence. The article mentioned complications during the surgery but offered almost no medical details. It never described the position of the wisdom tooth. It never mentioned the nerve. It never mentioned that another dentist had advised against immediate treatment only days earlier. Whoever wrote the article had reduced an entire tragedy to a few short paragraphs. Ivy slowly lowered the newspaper beside the X-ray. One showed the decision. The other showed the ending. Everything between those two moments was missing. Raymond watched her fold the clipping back along the same crease it had carried for years. His eyes never left the photograph of the young woman. "I carry those two pieces together," he said quietly, "so I never forget which came first." The room fell silent again. Outside, another car drove slowly past Franklin Family Dental before continuing down the street. It never turned into the parking lot. The X-ray remained on the viewing panel long after the newspaper clipping had been folded away. The longer Ivy studied it, the more details began to appear. Franklin hadn't written in long paragraphs. He never did. Small arrows pointed toward the roots. Tiny measurements filled the empty corners. Every mark answered a question that only another dentist would think to ask. The tooth hadn't erupted normally. The roots curved unusually close to the inferior alveolar nerve. The surrounding bone looked thinner than expected. None of those findings guaranteed disaster. Together, they demanded patience. Ivy reached for a pencil and copied each handwritten note onto a blank sheet of paper. Halfway through, she stopped. One sentence had been written more heavily than everything else. Recommend specialist evaluation before extraction. Franklin had underlined the final two words. Once. Nothing more. Denise walked over and looked at the same sentence. She smiled faintly without realizing it. That looks like him. Ivy didn't look away from the film. Denise rested one hand against the edge of the viewing panel. Whenever your father underlined something only once, it meant he'd already made up his mind. The room fell quiet again. Ivy read every note from the beginning one more time. There was no hesitation in Franklin's handwriting. No uncertainty. Every word pointed toward the same decision. Wait. Study the case again. Let another specialist look before anyone touched the tooth. She slowly lowered the film from the light box. The answer she had been searching for wasn't hidden inside the X-ray anymore. It was hidden somewhere after the X-ray, somewhere between Franklin's decision and the headline printed in that newspaper. Every patient Franklin had ever treated should have had a chart. That was one rule he never allowed anyone inside the clinic to break. Denise still remembered spending entire weekends filing old records because Franklin believed a dentist's memory could fail, but a properly documented chart never would. She walked toward the archive room at the end of the hallway and switched on the lights. Metal cabinets lined both walls from floor to ceiling. Each drawer carried handwritten labels arranged by year. Dust covered the upper shelves, untouched since the clinic had closed 18 years earlier. Denise pulled open the cabinet for that year without hesitation. The folders remained exactly where Franklin had left them. One after another, she checked every tab. The names were still in alphabetical order. Nothing looked disturbed. Ivy joined her a few moments later. Together, they searched the cabinet again, this time more slowly. Every file surrounding the date of the X-ray was still there. The patient before it, the patient after it. Even records from the same week remained untouched. Only one chart was missing. An empty space sat between two folders, barely wider than an inch. Denise rested her fingers against the gap. She didn't need to read the labels to know what should have been there. She had filed the record herself 18 years ago. "It was here," she whispered. Ivy looked at the narrow opening again. The cabinet hadn't been forced open. Nothing else had been taken. Whoever removed that chart hadn't been searching. They had known exactly which file they wanted. Raymond stood quietly at the doorway, watching neither woman nor cabinet. His eyes stayed fixed on the empty space where the missing record should have been. After a long silence, he spoke for the first time since they entered the archive room. "Someone made sure you would never find it." The archive room felt smaller after they returned to the reception area. Ivy spread the X-ray, the newspaper clipping, and the blank sheet containing Franklin's notes across the counter. 3 pieces of evidence. 3 different versions of the same day. The X-ray showed a dangerous case. Franklin's notes showed a careful decision. The newspaper told a much simpler story. A young woman had died following a dental procedure. The article never mentioned a second opinion. It never mentioned another clinic. It never mentioned that one dentist had refused to perform the extraction because he believed the risks were too high. Ivy read the clipping again. this time more slowly than before. Every paragraph described the tragedy. Every sentence focused on the family's grief. Yet one detail kept bothering her. No dentist was ever identified by name. Not the one who examined the patient first. Not the one who performed the surgery. It was as if the people involved had disappeared from the story, leaving only the outcome behind. Denise leaned over the counter and pointed to the publication date. The article had appeared only 2 days after the young woman died. "That was fast," she murmured. Ivy nodded. Too fast. A complicated dental complication usually required weeks, sometimes months, before investigators reached a conclusion. Yet this article had already turned uncertainty into fact. Someone had given the newspaper a story before the facts had settled. Raymond looked through the clinic window toward the empty parking lot. "People don't remember details," he said quietly. "They remember headlines." No one answered him. Ivy folded the clipping and placed it beside the X-ray once again. The newspaper hadn't destroyed Franklin's reputation by itself. It had simply become the version everyone repeated. The clock above the reception desk slipped past noon without a single patient sitting in the waiting room. The coffee Denise had made before sunrise had gone cold. 4 paper cups remained untouched beside the reception computer. The blue ribbon still hung across the front entrance exactly as it had at 8 o'clock that morning. Ivy walked through every treatment room before returning to the reception desk. The lights were still on. The monitors still displayed the welcome screen she had programmed the night before. Sterilized instruments remained sealed inside their trays. Even the disposable bibs were folded exactly the way she had left them before sunrise. It looked less like a clinic that had opened for business than one waiting for permission to begin. Denise quietly closed the appointment book. Every name scheduled for that morning had now been crossed out. Some patients never arrived. Others had called to apologize after making appointments elsewhere. None of them sounded angry. None of them sounded suspicious. Every conversation ended the same way. They believed Franklin Family Dental simply wasn't available anymore. Ivy rested both hands on the reception counter and looked through the glass doors toward the empty parking spaces outside. Hours earlier, she had imagined cutting the ribbon while patients waited inside. Instead, she had spent the entire morning watching cars leave one after another. Raymond picked up his coat. Before reaching the door, he stopped beside Franklin's photograph hanging on the wall. He studied it for several quiet seconds before turning back toward Ivy. "This isn't about today," he said. "It never was." The bell above the entrance rang softly as he stepped outside. Ivy remained standing where she was, watching the door slowly close behind him. Only after the clinic became silent again did she reach into her pocket and feel the plain white business card Cedric had left that morning. She didn't take it out. Not yet. The delivery truck arrived almost 40 minutes later than scheduled. It slowed in front of Franklin Family Dental, stopped for only a few seconds, then continued toward the next intersection without unloading a single box. Ivy watched it disappear through the front window before reaching for the purchase order lying on the reception desk. Every item on the list had been ordered weeks earlier. Filling materials, disposable suction tips, local anesthetic cartridges, sterile gloves. Nothing unusual, nothing expensive, just the supplies every dental clinic needed to stay open. The office phone rang before she finished reading the invoice. The warehouse manager apologized before Ivy had the chance to ask a question. The shipment had been canceled that morning. A larger client had purchased the remaining inventory, and the next delivery wouldn't arrive for at least 3 weeks. Ivy thanked him, ended the call, and immediately contacted another supplier. Then another. By the 4th phone call, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Every company gave a different explanation. Inventory shortage, delivery delays, contract changes. None of the reasons matched, but every answer ended the same way. They couldn't help Franklin Family Dental. Denise quietly lowered the receiver after finishing another call of her own. She didn't need to repeat what she had heard. Her expression said enough. Ivy folded the purchase order in half and placed it beneath the appointment book. Losing patients could be explained. Losing every supplier on the same morning could not. Someone wasn't trying to make the clinic struggle. Someone was making sure it never had the chance to begin. The first review appeared just after lunch. Denise noticed it while updating the clinic's business page. Franklin Family Dental had only been visible online for 3 days. Until that morning, it had no reviews at all. Now a single red star sat beneath its name. The account behind it had never posted another review before. The comment was only 1 sentence long. "Would never trust this place with my family." 10 minutes later, Another appeared. Different account. Different profile picture. The words changed, but the rating stayed the same. By mid-afternoon, there were 7 of them. None described an actual appointment. None mentioned a dentist's name. None referred to a treatment that had taken place inside the clinic. They simply repeated the same message in different ways. Stay away. Choose somewhere else. Not worth the risk. Ivy refreshed the page once more. 8 reviews, then 9. Denise quietly closed the laptop. She had worked beside Franklin long enough to know how difficult trust was to earn. Years of careful work could build it. A single afternoon could begin tearing it apart. Ivy looked through the reception window toward the street outside. Cars continued passing the clinic exactly as they had all morning. The building hadn't changed. The people inside hadn't changed. Yet before Franklin Family Dental had treated a single patient, strangers who had never stepped through its doors were already telling the city to avoid it. Ivy rested one hand on the reception counter and remained silent for a long moment. The attack had changed again. It no longer needed black sedans or sealed envelopes. It had found a way to reach people who had never even heard Franklin's name. The email arrived at 2:17 that afternoon. It contained only 3 short paragraphs and 1 attachment. Ivy recognized the sender before opening it. Melissa had accepted the receptionist position nearly a month earlier. She had toured the clinic twice, completed every employment form, and even spent an entire Saturday helping Denise organize patient records before the reopening. Her first official shift was supposed to begin the following morning. Ivy read the email from beginning to end without scrolling back. Melissa apologized for the inconvenience. She thanked Ivy for the opportunity. Then she explained she had accepted another position effective immediately. No complaints, no demands, no hard feelings. The attached letter carried a digital signature and today's date. Ivy closed the message and sat quietly for a few moments. Denise didn't ask what it said. She had already guessed. Another clinic? Ivy nodded once. Denise let out a slow breath. She had hired enough people over the years to recognize the pattern. Patients disappeared. Supplies disappeared. Now employees were disappearing before they even walked through the front door. The office phone rang again. This time, the conversation lasted less than a minute. When Ivy returned the receiver to its cradle, another name quietly disappeared from the schedule. A dental assistant who had agreed to work part-time during the reopening had also changed her mind. Better pay. Better benefits. Immediate start. The explanation sounded almost identical to the email Ivy had just finished reading. Denise slowly looked around the reception area. 4 treatment rooms, 2 dentists' offices, a sterilization room Franklin had been proud of when he built it. Every room was ready. Every chair was empty. "He's not trying to beat us," she said softly. "He's trying to make sure we never become a clinic." Ivy didn't answer. She folded Melissa's resignation letter, slipped it into a drawer beneath the reception desk, and quietly locked it away. Denver Dental Partners appeared at the top of every employment contract Ivy opened that afternoon. The same company name appeared on Melissa's resignation letter. It appeared again on the assistant's hiring paperwork that had been forwarded by mistake. By the 3rd document, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Ivy opened her laptop and searched the name. The results filled the screen almost instantly. 25 dental clinics across Denver and the surrounding suburbs. Hundreds of employees. Thousands of patient reviews. New locations opening almost every year. Their advertisements appeared on local news websites, buses, and billboards across the city. Ivy had seen the logo before without paying attention to it. Now it seemed to appear everywhere she looked. She clicked through clinic after clinic. Different buildings, different staff. The same blue logo in every photograph. At the bottom of the company's website sat the name of its founder and chief executive, Grant Holloway. It was the first time Ivy had seen more than a handwritten signature. There was only one public photograph. Grant stood beside a newly opened clinic, wearing a dark suit without a tie. He wasn't smiling for the camera. He wasn't shaking hands or cutting a ribbon. He simply stood slightly behind the staff, allowing the clinic to occupy more of the photograph than he did. Ivy looked at the picture longer than she expected. She had imagined someone older, someone louder, someone who enjoyed being seen. The man in the photograph looked almost ordinary. Denise quietly stepped beside her and read the company profile over Ivy's shoulder. The final line caught both of their attention. Dedicated to raising the standard of patient safety across Colorado. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Ivy slowly closed the laptop. Franklin Family Dental had spent its first day fighting for the chance to treat one patient. Grant had spent 18 years building an empire around the promise of protecting them. The photograph on Denver Dental Partners' website stayed in Ivy's mind long after she closed the laptop. It wasn't Grant's face she kept remembering. It was the sentence beneath it, dedicated to raising the standard of patient safety across Colorado. The words followed her through the empty treatment rooms as she completed the closing checklist alone. Every cabinet was still full. Every instrument remained sealed. The suction lines had never been used. The ultrasonic scaler in room 2 had never been switched on. Franklin Family Dental had survived its first day without treating a single patient. Ivy reached for the light switch in the last operatory when her cell phone vibrated inside her pocket. The number wasn't saved. She almost let it ring out before answering. A calm voice greeted her without introducing itself. Miss Ivy. She recognized it immediately. Cedric. He spoke with the same measured tone he had used that morning, as though the entire day had unfolded exactly the way he had expected. Grant asked me to check whether your first day went well. Ivy looked through the glass wall toward the reception area. The appointment book still lay open where Denise had left it. Every morning appointment had been crossed out in red. You already know the answer. A brief silence followed. Yes, Cedric didn't deny it. Then why call? Another pause. Because Grant wanted me to remind you that his offer is still available. Ivy glanced toward Franklin's name above the entrance. The brass letters reflected the orange light of the setting sun exactly the way they had that morning. Nothing about the building had changed. Everything around it had. Tell Grant something for me, Cedric waited. Tomorrow morning, I'll unlock the doors again. The line remained quiet for 2 or 3 seconds. When Cedric finally spoke, his voice sounded exactly the same as before. Calm, respectful, almost gentle. I'll let him know. The call ended. Ivy lowered the phone slowly. It was the first conversation she had ever had with someone who worked for Grant. Somehow it left her with the feeling that she hadn't spoken to Cedric at all. She had spoken to Grant without ever hearing his voice. Denver woke before sunrise. Delivery trucks rolled through downtown. Coffee shops switched on their lights one by one. Commuters filled the streets exactly as they had the day before. Franklin Family Dental looked almost unchanged from the outside. The ribbon had been removed during the evening. The flowers Denise arranged still stood beside the entrance, though the petals had already begun to curl at the edges after a full day in the summer heat. Ivy unlocked the front door at exactly 7:30. She didn't know whether any patients would come. She unlocked it anyway. Denise arrived a few minutes later carrying fresh coffee, just as she always had when Franklin still owned the clinic. Neither woman mentioned the previous day. There was nothing left to say about it. The reception computer finished starting up. The appointment schedule appeared on the screen. 3 names remained for the morning, fewer than half of what they had originally booked. Ivy stood quietly behind the reception desk watching the parking lot through the front windows. Every passing car made her lift her eyes for a moment before moving on. At 7:58, a white pickup slowed in front of the clinic. It signaled, turned into the parking lot, then stopped. An older man climbed out carrying a baseball cap in one hand and a folded appointment reminder in the other. He stood beside his truck for several seconds looking at the sign above the entrance. This time, there were no black sedans waiting across the street. No one stepped in front of him. No phone rang. He started walking toward the clinic. Ivy felt herself take a slow breath without realizing it. The man reached for the front door. Then he stopped. His eyes settled on something taped to the glass just beside the handle. He leaned closer to read it. A few seconds later, he quietly folded the appointment reminder, turned around, and walked back to his truck without ever opening the door. Ivy hurried outside just as the pickup backed out of the parking space. By the time she reached the sidewalk, it had already disappeared into the morning traffic. She looked at the front door. A single sheet of white paper had been taped neatly beside the handle sometime before sunrise. There was no signature at the bottom, only one sentence printed in large black letters. This clinic is under investigation. Patient services are temporarily suspended. Ivy stared at the notice without blinking. She knew immediately it wasn't there when she locked the door the night before. Someone had returned after midnight, and they hadn't come to threaten her. They had come to make sure nobody ever walked inside. The paper came off the glass without much effort. One strip of clear tape had been enough to keep it in place through the night. Ivy turned it over in her hands. The back was blank. The front carried no government seal, no agency name, no case number, and no signature. At first glance, it looked official. At second glance, it fell apart. Denise took the page from her and read it again from top to bottom. The wording was careful. Whoever wrote it knew exactly which words would make people leave without asking questions. Under investigation. Temporarily suspended. Most people would never question a notice like that. They would simply turn around and find another clinic. Denise folded the paper once and placed it on the reception desk. It's fake, Ivy already knew. The older man in the pickup had believed it. So would the next patient. She stepped outside and looked carefully along the edge of the front windows. Tiny pieces of clear tape still clung to the glass where someone had pressed them down only hours earlier. Nothing had been damaged. No locks had been forced. Whoever came during the night had taken their time, taped the notice neatly beside the handle, then walked away without leaving another trace. It wasn't vandalism. It was calculation. Ivy looked across the street. Morning traffic continued moving through the intersection. Parents walked children toward a nearby elementary school. Office workers carried coffee toward downtown. Hundreds of people passed Franklin Family Dental every hour. It would take only a handful of them reading that notice before the rumor spread farther than the paper itself ever could. Denise quietly picked the page up again. We'll need to tell every patient who calls. Ivy shook her head. No. Denise looked at her. Ivy took the notice back, tore it cleanly down the middle, then again. 4 pieces became 8. She dropped them into the trash beneath the reception desk. We'll tell them by staying open. The phone remained unusually quiet for the rest of the morning. No new appointments appeared. No cancellations came in. It was almost as though Franklin Family Dental had disappeared from Denver overnight. Ivy spent the empty hours calling former patients whose names she recognized from Franklin's old records. Some numbers no longer existed. Some belonged to children who had long since grown into adults. A few people remembered Franklin immediately. They remembered his patience. They remembered how he always explained every procedure before touching an instrument. They remembered the clinic, but every conversation ended the same way. Nobody knew where he had gone after closing the practice. Shortly after noon, one call finally broke the pattern. An elderly woman answered on the 4th ring. She fell silent the moment Ivy mentioned Franklin's name. Nearly 10 seconds passed before she spoke again. I thought he was dead. Ivy tightened her grip on the phone. You knew my father? Everyone around here knew Franklin. Another pause followed. The woman sounded as though she were deciding how much to say. He came to see someone every Thursday afternoon. Ivy glanced at Denise, who had stopped sorting files and was listening from across the room. Who? The woman didn't answer immediately. Papers rustled softly through the receiver. Then came a quiet sigh. A nursing home on the west side of Denver. Ivy reached for a pen before the address had even been finished. Who was he visiting? This time the silence lasted much longer. When the woman finally spoke again, her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. Not a patient. The line remained still for another heartbeat. The young woman's mother. The address stayed on the notepad long after the call ended. Ivy recognized the neighborhood immediately. West Denver had changed over the past 18 years, but that part of the city had not. Small brick houses still lined the streets. Old grocery stores still stood on the corners. The nursing home sat only 4 miles from Franklin Family Dental, close enough to drive there in less than 15 minutes. Denise looked at the address twice before speaking. She had never heard Franklin mention it. Not once. She had shared an office with him for more than 20 years. She knew the names of his patients. She knew which families sent Christmas cards every December. She even knew which elderly patients refused to let anyone except Franklin clean their teeth. Yet she had never heard of this place. Ivy folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. The morning had finally given her something different. Not another obstacle. A direction. She locked the reception desk, picked up her keys, and looked once more at the empty waiting room before walking toward the door. Every chair remained empty. Every room remained ready. The clinic could wait another hour. The truth had already waited 18 years. The nursing home overlooked a small public park where children chased pigeons beneath rows of old maple trees. The building itself showed its age. Faded paint peeled from the window frames, and flower beds near the entrance had long since grown wild. A receptionist looked up as Ivy walked inside and quietly asked who she had come to visit. Ivy hesitated. She didn't know the woman's name. She only knew who she had lost. The receptionist studied her for a moment before pointing toward the back garden. She's out there every afternoon. Ivy followed the stone path until she reached a narrow courtyard filled with wooden benches and flowering shrubs. An elderly woman sat alone beside the window, knitting without looking at the needles in her hands. The blanket resting across her lap had been repaired so many times that no two sections carried the same color of yarn. A small framed photograph stood on the table beside her. The glass had been scratched by years of sunlight, but the smiling face inside was still easy to recognize. It was the same young woman Ivy had seen in the newspaper clipping. Older memories had preserved the same smile better than the newspaper ever could. Ivy stopped walking. She suddenly understood why Franklin had kept returning to this place. The woman didn't look up immediately. She continued knitting another row before quietly setting the needles aside. Her eyes rested on Ivy for only a moment before drifting toward the photograph again. "You have his eyes," she said softly. "I wondered if this day would ever come." The woman rested both hands on the folded blanket and studied Ivy for a long moment before speaking again. There was no surprise in her face, only the quiet expression of someone who had expected this meeting years earlier. The photograph beside her caught the afternoon sunlight, brightening the smile of the young woman inside it. Ivy recognized the same graduation picture from the newspaper clipping. It looked different here, less like evidence, more like family. She pulled a chair closer and sat down without taking her eyes off the frame. Neither of them hurried the silence. Children laughed somewhere beyond the garden fence. A sprinkler hissed across the lawn before shutting off again. The woman finally reached for the photograph and brushed a thumb gently across the glass. "Franklin used to do that too," she said. Every Thursday, Ivy listened without interrupting. "He never came empty-handed." The woman smiled faintly at the memory. "Sometimes flowers, sometimes fruit, sometimes just coffee." She paused. "Most weeks we hardly talked at all." Ivy lowered her eyes. That wasn't the image she had carried of her father for the past 18 years. She had imagined guilt, shame, hiding. Not a man quietly driving across Denver every Thursday simply to sit beside a grieving mother. "Did you ever blame him?" The question escaped before Ivy realized she had spoken it. The woman looked back toward the photograph instead of answering immediately. "For a long time," she stopped. Her fingers tightened slightly around the frame. "I blamed every dentist." The words settled gently between them. No anger, no bitterness, just exhaustion worn smooth by time. "Franklin never argued with me." Another pause followed. "He just kept coming." The photograph returned to its place beside the window. The woman folded her hands together again, as though the memory itself had become heavy. Ivy noticed another chair standing beside the bench. Its wooden armrest had been worn smooth by years of use. Someone had spent many afternoons sitting there. "The nurses used to tell him not to come," the woman said quietly. "They thought seeing him only made things harder." She smiled, though there was little happiness behind it. "They were wrong." Ivy remained silent. The woman continued, looking out toward the park where a grandfather helped his granddaughter learn to ride a bicycle. "He never asked me to forgive him." She shook her head once. "Not even once." Ivy felt the sentence linger far longer than the words themselves. Most people who carried guilt wanted forgiveness. Franklin, apparently, had wanted something else. "What did he talk about?" The woman thought for a moment. "Your school," Ivy frowned slightly. "My school?" "Every Thursday," a faint smile returned. "He told me what grade you were in, what books you liked, how proud he was whenever you brought home another report card." Ivy looked down at her hands. She hadn't known any of this. Not one Thursday, not one visit. Franklin had carried that part of his life alone. The woman slowly reached into the pocket of her sweater and removed a folded piece of paper. The edges had softened from being opened too many times. She held it for several seconds before placing it in Ivy's hand. "He left this with me the last time I saw him." Ivy unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a letter. It was a single page torn from a yellow legal pad. Franklin's handwriting filled only the top half. The final sentence ended halfway across the page, as though he had intended to keep writing but never did. At the bottom, beneath everything else, one line stood alone. "If Ivy ever comes looking for answers, tell her I never stopped waiting for the right time." The paper trembled slightly between Ivy's fingers. Not because the afternoon breeze had reached the garden, because she had recognized Franklin's handwriting before reading the first word. It was the same careful script she had seen on the X-ray only hours earlier. Neat, measured, every letter evenly spaced, as though he had rewritten the sentence in his mind before putting it on paper. The note wasn't addressed to anyone. It looked more like something Franklin had written for himself before deciding to leave it behind. Ivy read the first line, then the second. Then she stopped halfway through the page. Franklin had written about only one thing: responsibility. Not blame, not punishment, responsibility. He believed every decision a dentist made stayed with the patient long after the appointment ended. Some decisions followed the dentist home as well. Ivy lowered the page before reaching the unfinished sentence near the bottom. She wasn't ready to read it yet. The woman beside her watched quietly, allowing the silence to do what words could not. It was the same silence Franklin had brought with him every Thursday. The afternoon sun had shifted across the garden by the time Ivy folded the page again. She slipped it back into the envelope with more care than she had used for the X-ray or the newspaper clipping. Somehow the unfinished note felt more fragile than both of them together. It carried no medical opinion, no evidence. Only the thoughts of a man who had spent 18 years living beside one decision. Ivy looked toward the elderly woman. One question had been waiting since the moment she arrived. Why did he stop coming? The woman didn't answer immediately. Her eyes drifted toward the empty chair beside her. He didn't stop, Ivy frowned. Then, the woman gently shook her head. I stopped him. The words landed softly, yet they changed everything. She reached for the photograph of her daughter and held it against her chest. One day I told him he had punished himself long enough. A faint smile crossed her face before fading again. I told him if he wanted to honor my daughter, he needed to start living instead of apologizing. Ivy listened without moving. Did he? The woman looked out across the park where the children had already gone home. I don't know, she paused. He stood up, thanked me, and said there was still one person he hadn't found the courage to face. Her eyes slowly returned to Ivy. I knew he was talking about you. The conversation ended there. Neither of them tried to fill the silence that followed. The woman rested the photograph back on the table and slowly resumed knitting, though her hands moved more slowly than before. Ivy remained seated for another minute, watching the yarn slip quietly between weathered fingers. 18 years earlier, two families had lost someone. One had buried a daughter. The other had slowly watched a father disappear without ever leaving home. They had lived through different tragedies, yet both had measured time in exactly the same way. Before that day. After that day. Ivy thanked the woman before standing. She slipped Franklin's note into her bag, careful not to crease it again. As she turned to leave, the woman spoke one last time. If you find him. Ivy stopped. Tell him I kept my promise. Ivy looked back. The woman smiled gently. I waited until you were ready. Ivy nodded without trusting herself to answer. She walked through the garden, past the reception desk, and back into the parking lot. The late afternoon sun had already begun dropping behind the buildings across the street. She unlocked her car but didn't start the engine. Instead, she unfolded Franklin's unfinished note one more time. This time, she read every word from beginning to end. The final sentence still broke off halfway across the page. There was no signature beneath it, only empty space. For the first time since reopening the clinic, Ivy no longer felt as though she were chasing pieces of evidence. She was following the footsteps of her father. Traffic slowed as people left work for the evening. Cars filled the streets around the nursing home one after another, their headlights beginning to replace the fading sunlight. Ivy pulled out of the parking lot and waited at the first traffic light. Without thinking, she glanced into the rearview mirror. A black SUV sat 3 cars behind her. Nothing unusual. Denver was full of black SUVs. The light turned green. Traffic moved again. She drove another 6 blocks before looking into the mirror a second time. The same SUV remained behind her. It followed through 2 turns without changing lanes. Ivy said nothing. She wasn't even certain it was following her. By the time she reached Franklin Family Dental, the SUV continued straight through the intersection without slowing down. She watched it disappear before unlocking the clinic. Denise was still inside, sorting supplies that had never been used. She looked up the moment Ivy entered. Did you find anything? Ivy placed Franklin's handwritten note on the reception counter. Denise read only the last line before quietly lowering the page. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Outside, the sound of another engine drifted past the front windows. It didn't stop. It didn't honk. It simply passed the clinic once, then disappeared into the evening traffic. Denise looked toward the street. Do you think Grant knows where you've been today? Ivy folded the note carefully and slipped it back into her bag. Her eyes remained on the window a moment longer before she answered. I think Grant has known where I was going since the moment I left this morning. Morning arrived with something Franklin Family Dental hadn't seen since reopening. A voicemail. Ivy played it through the speaker while Denise unlocked the reception desk. The caller never introduced himself. His voice sounded old, hesitant, as though he had almost hung up several times before leaving the message. He only asked one question. Is Franklin really your father? The recording ended before Ivy could hear another word. No phone number had been left behind. Denise replayed it once more, hoping she had missed something. She hadn't. Whoever called wanted confirmation, not conversation. Ivy saved the message instead of deleting it. Before noon, 2 more calls arrived. Both ended the same way. People asked about Franklin. None of them asked for an appointment. None mentioned tooth pain. None wanted treatment. They wanted the past. By lunchtime, Ivy understood something she hadn't noticed before. Franklin's name still lived in Denver. People hadn't forgotten it. They had simply stopped saying it out loud. Raymond's words returned to her without warning. People remember headlines. Ivy looked toward Franklin's photograph hanging behind the reception desk. For 18 years, strangers had remembered a story. Very few had ever searched for the truth behind it. Nearly 6 miles away, the top floor of Denver Dental Partners overlooked most of downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the corner office, but the man standing beside them wasn't looking at the skyline. He was looking at a tablet resting on his desk. The screen displayed a single photograph, Franklin Family Dental, taken less than an hour earlier. The blue sign, the front entrance. Ivy unlocking the door. Nothing else. Cedric stood several feet away, waiting quietly. He had worked beside Grant long enough to know silence usually meant his employer was thinking rather than deciding. Grant placed the tablet down without asking another question. Everything he needed had already been answered. Franklin Family Dental had opened again. Ivy hadn't accepted the offer. She hadn't called the number on the business card. She had gone somewhere else instead. Cedric finally spoke. She visited West Denver yesterday. Grant gave a small nod. His expression didn't change. She met Margaret. Another nod. Cedric waited, expecting instructions. None came. Grant walked toward the window and rested one hand against the glass. Morning traffic flowed through downtown exactly as it did every weekday. Thousands of people crossed intersections without realizing 2 lives had begun moving toward each other again after 18 years. Grant spoke without turning around. Did she ask about Franklin? Yes. Good. Cedric looked up slightly. It wasn't the answer he had expected. Grant remained facing the city. She deserves to know who her father really was. The room fell silent again. A few seconds later, Grant added one final sentence, almost to himself. Then she'll understand why I can never let that clinic stay open. The waiting room remained empty for most of the morning. By now, Ivy had stopped lifting her eyes every time a car slowed in front of the clinic. Most of them never stopped. Those that did usually continued driving after a few seconds. The fake notice had been removed the day before, but its work had already been done. Rumors traveled much farther than paper. Denise quietly wiped the reception counter for the 3rd time that morning. Nothing needed cleaning anymore. It simply gave her hands something to do. Just before 10 o'clock, the front door opened. Neither woman moved immediately. They had learned not to celebrate too soon. A man in his late 50s stepped inside carrying a faded baseball cap. He closed the door behind him, looked around the waiting room once, then walked toward the reception desk. He didn't ask for directions. He didn't hesitate. He already knew where he was. Ivy smiled. Good morning. The man nodded politely but didn't sit down. His eyes drifted to Franklin's photograph hanging behind the counter. He studied it for several quiet seconds before speaking. He used to be my dentist. Ivy followed his gaze. Yes, the man nodded again. Best one I ever had. He reached into his pocket, unfolded an appointment reminder, and placed it on the counter. I almost didn't come. Ivy didn't interrupt. 3 people told me this clinic had been shut down. He smiled faintly. Then yesterday, my wife reminded me something Franklin once told us. He paused, almost amused by the memory. Never trust what you hear about a dentist. Sit in the chair first. Denise couldn't help smiling. It sounded exactly like Franklin. The man finally sat down in the waiting area. It was the first time since reopening that someone had chosen the chair instead of the exit. Ivy picked up his chart and quietly called his name. As he followed her toward the treatment room, the bell above the front door rang again. This time it wasn't another patient. Cedric stepped inside alone. Cedric waited until the treatment room door closed before walking to the reception desk. His suit looked exactly the same as it had on opening day. Even his expression hadn't changed. Calm, patient, controlled. Denise crossed her arms without saying a word. Cedric noticed the occupied waiting room before looking back at her. One empty chair, one missing patient file, one closed treatment room. That was enough to tell him someone had finally stayed. He gave a small nod, almost as though he had expected it to happen sooner or later. Denise spoke first. "We're busy," Cedric smiled politely. "That's good." He placed a sealed envelope on the counter. It looked almost identical to the first one. Denise didn't touch it. Neither did Cedric. Grant asked me to deliver one message. He rested his fingertips lightly on the envelope. "The offer has changed." Denise remained silent. "It's no longer about buying the building." Cedric looked toward the hallway where Ivy was treating her patient. The sound of dental instruments drifted faintly through the closed door. For the first time since arriving, something almost human crossed his face. Not frustration, respect. "Tell Miss Ivy," he paused briefly, "that Grant won't interrupt another patient." Denise looked at him carefully. "Then what does he want?" Cedric's eyes returned to the envelope. "He wants her to finish treating this one." He turned toward the exit before adding one final sentence. "After that, everything changes." The bell above the door rang softly as he disappeared back into the Denver morning. Denise looked at the unopened envelope for several seconds. Then she turned toward the treatment room where the sound of Franklin's old handpiece echoed through the hallway for the very first time in 18 years. The procedure lasted just under 40 minutes. It wasn't a complicated case. A fractured molar hidden beneath an old filling. The kind of treatment Franklin had performed thousands of times during his career without anyone remembering it a week later. Ivy adjusted the overhead light one final time, checked the patient's bite, then polished the new restoration until the rough edge disappeared beneath her Explorer. When she lowered the chair, the man slowly closed his mouth and tested his teeth together twice. The sharp pain that had followed him through the past several days was gone. He sat quietly for another moment before smiling, almost surprised by the absence of discomfort. Ivy handed him a mirror. He looked at the repaired tooth for only a few seconds before setting it back on the tray. Some patients cared more about relief than appearances. He thanked Ivy, thanked Denise for helping him schedule the appointment, then paused beside Franklin's photograph on his way out. He studied the picture longer than anyone else had since the clinic reopened. "Your father fixed this same tooth almost 20 years ago," he said softly. "It lasted longer than my truck." A faint laugh escaped before he shook his head. "I should have come back sooner." Ivy smiled but said nothing. There wasn't much to add. The man placed his baseball cap back on his head, pushed open the front door, and stepped into the Denver sunlight without looking over his shoulder again. The bell above the entrance rang once before the clinic became quiet. Denise picked up the completed chart and laid it carefully on the reception desk. It was the only patient record created that day. Yet somehow it made the empty waiting room feel different. Franklin Family Dental was no longer a clinic that had only prepared to open. It had finally treated someone. Ivy removed her gloves and washed her hands slowly, watching the water disappear into the sink. Outside, traffic continued moving past the building exactly as it had all morning. Most drivers never glanced toward the sign. One patient had. One patient had trusted the name Franklin enough to walk through the door despite everything he had heard. Ivy dried her hands and returned to the reception area. The envelope Cedric had delivered earlier still rested exactly where he had left it. She looked at it for several quiet seconds before breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Only one sentence had been printed across the center. "Congratulations on treating your first patient." The address stayed in Ivy's coat pocket for the rest of the afternoon. She took it out twice, read it, then slipped it back again. Lincoln Avenue wasn't home to another dental office. It was where Denver Dental Partners operated its headquarters. 25 clinics across Colorado answered to that building. Denise recognized the address the moment Ivy placed the card on the reception desk before closing time. Neither woman suggested ignoring it. Neither suggested going. They simply stood in silence, each waiting for the other to decide first. Outside, the last sunlight reflected across Franklin Family Dental, turning the brass letters above the entrance a deep shade of gold. Ivy switched off the reception lights one by one. The treatment rooms fell dark. The sterilization room followed. Finally, only the small lamp beneath Franklin's photograph remained. She stopped beside it before leaving. 18 years earlier, Franklin had walked out of this building believing he might never come back. 18 years later, someone was asking his daughter to walk into another building for answers. Ivy picked up her bag, slipped the address into the inside pocket, and locked the front door behind her. Across the street, a black sedan remained parked beneath a row of maple trees. It had been there long before the clinic closed for the day. It didn't follow her when she drove away. It simply stayed where it was, facing the entrance of Franklin Family Dental as daylight slowly disappeared from Denver. The next morning began differently. No black sedan waited across the street. No notice had been taped to the front door. The parking lot remained empty, but the silence no longer felt the same. Franklin Family Dental had already treated one patient. That single chart resting inside the filing cabinet proved the clinic existed for more than memories. Ivy switched on the reception computer and opened the appointment schedule. 2 names remained for the day. She recognized neither of them. Denise finished brewing coffee before walking over with a small stack of old appointment cards Franklin had kept from years ago. The handwriting on every card belonged to him. Most of the names had long since moved away or found new dentists. But Denise had spent the previous evening calling every number that still worked. Some never answered, some politely declined. A few promised they would think about it. One family had asked the same question everyone else seemed to ask. Is Franklin back? Denise never knew how to answer that question. Franklin wasn't inside the clinic, but every room around her still carried the way he had practiced. Ivy quietly read through the list of former patients one more time. Some had trusted Franklin for 20 years before the clinic closed. If even a handful decided to come back, Franklin Family Dental might survive long enough to tell its own story instead of letting other people tell it. The front door opened just after 9. Both women looked up at the same time. An elderly couple stepped inside together. Neither carried an appointment reminder. The husband removed his cap before speaking. "We heard Franklin's daughter reopen the place." Ivy smiled. "She did." The man looked around the reception area for several seconds before nodding slowly. "Then we'd like to come back." Less than 30 minutes later, another patient chart rested on the reception desk. A second appointment was booked before the elderly couple even left the parking lot. Shortly afterward, the office phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a cancellation. A woman asked whether Franklin Family Dental was accepting new patients after hearing the clinic had reopened. Denise wrote down her information while Ivy glanced toward the waiting room. It still wasn't busy, but it finally felt like a place people expected to return to. 6 miles away, Cedric stood inside Grant's office with a thin folder in his hands. 3 completed appointments, he said. Grant read the page without interrupting. 2 new consultations. Another quiet nod followed. The clinic is beginning to recover. Grant closed the folder and walked toward the window overlooking downtown Denver. Morning traffic flowed steadily below. "People come back because of memories," he said. Cedric remained silent. Grant kept his eyes on the city. "The question is whether memories are enough." Neither man spoke after that. Somewhere beyond the skyline, Franklin Family Dental had survived another ordinary morning. For the first time since reopening, the clinic no longer looked like a building trying to reopen. It looked like one slowly finding its patients again. The mail arrived just before noon. Among utility bills and advertising flyers lay a plain white envelope with no return address and no postage stamp. Someone had delivered it by hand. Denise placed it on the reception desk beside the appointment book. Neither of them reached for it immediately. By now, plain white envelopes had become familiar. They rarely carried good news. Ivy finally picked it up and unfolded the single page inside. There was no signature, no company logo, no threat. Just a photocopy of an old newspaper article. It was the same headline Raymond had shown her 2 days earlier. This version, however, had one sentence highlighted in yellow. The family questioned whether warning signs had been ignored before the procedure. Ivy read the line twice. It still didn't mention Franklin by name. Yet anyone reading it beside the clinic sign could easily reach the conclusion someone wanted them to reach. Denise quietly took the paper from Ivy and turned it over. The back was blank. Whoever delivered it hadn't wanted to start an argument. They only wanted to remind Ivy that the past could still be used against her. Ivy folded the page once and slipped it into a drawer without another word. The first patient of the afternoon walked through the front door less than 5 minutes later. She greeted him with the same smile she had offered every patient that morning. Whatever waited inside the drawer could wait a little longer. The afternoon finished with 4 completed appointments. It wasn't enough to call the reopening a success, but it was enough to prove the clinic was alive. Denise locked the reception desk while Ivy completed the last patient note of the day. The numbers were still small, yet every completed chart made the filing cabinet feel heavier than it had the day before. As they prepared to leave, the office phone rang one final time. Ivy almost let the answering machine take it before reaching for the receiver. The caller introduced himself as a representative from the clinic's malpractice insurance carrier. His voice remained professional from beginning to end. He explained that the company had received several inquiries regarding Franklin Family Dental during the previous 48 hours. They weren't canceling the policy. Not yet. They simply wanted additional documentation before continuing coverage. Ivy listened without interrupting. She already understood what had happened. Someone had started asking questions before the clinic had even completed its first week of business. After the call ended, Denise remained standing beside the reception desk for a long moment. "They're trying every door," she said quietly. Ivy nodded. Patients, suppliers, employees, online reviews, now insurance. None of the attacks had closed the clinic by themselves. Together, they were slowly tightening around it. Ivy looked across the quiet waiting room before switching off the final light. "Then we'll keep opening every morning," Denise smiled faintly. It sounded exactly like something Franklin would have said. Outside, the clinic disappeared into the Denver evening, but for the first time since reopening, neither woman drove home wondering whether the doors would stay closed the next day. The waiting room was already occupied when the front door opened again. A man in his early 40s stepped inside carrying no appointment card, no insurance folder, and no visible sign of pain. He paused just inside the entrance and looked around with the quiet attention of someone trying to remember a place he hadn't seen in years. His eyes moved from the reception desk to Franklin's photograph, then to the hallway leading toward the treatment rooms. Denise greeted him with the same smile she offered everyone else. "Do you have an appointment?" The man shook his head. No, he didn't walk any farther into the clinic. Instead, he studied the framed licenses hanging on the wall beside the reception desk. Every certificate now carried Ivy's name. Franklin's old licenses were gone. The man finally looked back at Denise. "Is Franklin here?" Denise answered honestly. "No," he nodded once, almost as though he had expected that answer before walking through the door. "Then I'll come back another day." Ivy stepped out from the treatment room after hearing the conversation. "Can I help you with something?" The man looked at her for a long second. Whatever question he had planned to ask disappeared before reaching his lips. He gave a polite smile instead. "No, I just wanted to see whether this place had really reopened." He turned and walked toward the exit. Ivy watched him leave without trying to stop him. Something about the visit felt unfinished. The man hadn't asked for treatment. He hadn't asked about prices. He hadn't even given his name. He had only come to see whether Franklin Family Dental still existed. After he disappeared from the parking lot, Denise quietly picked up the visitor log lying on the counter. The line for walk-in visitors remained blank. There was nothing to write. The clinic closed an hour later than usual. 4 completed treatments, 3 new appointments, and another handful of consultation requests had filled most of the afternoon. It was still a small practice, but every evening looked slightly different from the one before. Ivy finished locking the sterilization room before checking the voicemail one last time. Only one new message waited. The caller never identified himself. His voice remained calm throughout the recording. "You're doing better than expected." A brief pause followed. "That won't last." The message ended there. No shouting, no threats, no insults, just 2 short sentences spoken with complete certainty. Denise replayed the recording once before deleting it. "Should we report this?" she asked quietly. Ivy thought about it for a moment before shaking her head. "Report what?" There was no crime in the message, no evidence, no name, only words. Ivy switched off the reception lights and stood for a brief moment beneath Franklin's photograph. Whoever had left the voicemail wanted one thing above all else. They wanted her attention. She picked up her bag, locked the front door, and walked into the Denver evening without listening to the message again. Somewhere across the city, someone would be disappointed that the call had changed nothing. Wednesday's appointment book contained something the previous 2 mornings had not. Every time slot before lunch had a name beside it. Some appointments were only consultations. Others were routine cleanings or fillings. None of them were complicated procedures. Ivy didn't mind. After the first week, ordinary dentistry felt like a victory. She was reviewing the morning charts when one name caught her attention: Margaret. The surname looked familiar before she remembered why. Margaret, the elderly woman from the nursing home. Ivy looked at the phone number twice to make sure it wasn't another patient with the same last name. It wasn't. Denise noticed the change in her expression and quietly walked over. Is something wrong? Ivy turned the schedule toward her. Denise smiled the moment she recognized the name. No explanation was needed. Nearly an hour later, a taxi stopped outside Franklin Family Dental. The driver helped Margaret onto the sidewalk before returning to the car. She refused the wheelchair the nursing home had sent with her. One careful step at a time, she walked toward the clinic using only a wooden cane polished smooth from years of use. Ivy met her at the entrance before she reached for the handle. Margaret looked up at the sign above the door and remained there for several quiet seconds. He wanted me to come here once, she said softly. I was never ready. She looked back at Ivy. Today I am. Margaret wasn't there because of a toothache. During the examination, Ivy found only a loose crown that had begun shifting whenever she chewed. It could be repaired in less than 20 minutes. The treatment itself was simple. What made the appointment different was everything surrounding it. Margaret looked around the operatory with quiet curiosity, touching nothing, yet recognizing more than Ivy expected. The cabinet beside the window. The old light mounted above the chair. Even the small ceramic vase Denise had placed near the sink. Franklin chose that color, she said, looking at the pale blue walls. He said nervous patients relaxed more when the room reminded them of the sky. Ivy paused for just a moment before continuing the examination. She had never heard that story before. Margaret smiled faintly as Ivy adjusted the overhead light. He used to explain every step before he touched an instrument. Ivy realized she had done exactly the same thing without thinking. Some habits had survived 18 years without anyone teaching them. A few minutes later, the loose crown had been cleaned, recemented, and polished back into place. Margaret tested it gently, then nodded with satisfaction. She didn't stand immediately. Instead, she rested one hand on the arm of the dental chair and slowly looked around the room one final time. This chair stayed empty for too long, she whispered. Ivy didn't answer. She simply helped the elderly woman to her feet. As they walked back toward the reception desk, neither of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street. Inside, Cedric lowered the binoculars from his eyes and quietly placed a phone call. She's here, he said. Margaret is sitting in Franklin's chair. On the other end of the line, Grant remained silent for several seconds before answering with only 3 words. Don't stop her. Margaret insisted on paying before leaving. Denise told her the repair had taken only a few minutes and could wait until her next visit. The elderly woman smiled and shook her head. Franklin never let me leave without a receipt, Denise laughed quietly. Some things haven't changed. Margaret folded the receipt into her purse with slow, careful hands before walking toward the entrance. She stopped beneath Franklin's photograph one last time. For several seconds, she simply looked at the smiling man inside the frame. 18 years had added gray hair to everyone who had known him. The photograph hadn't changed at all. He would have liked today, she whispered. Then she stepped outside. Ivy walked her to the waiting taxi. Before getting in, Margaret turned back toward the clinic. There are people who still remember your father for the dentist he really was. She paused, searching Ivy's face. They've just been quiet for a very long time. The taxi pulled away a few moments later. Ivy remained on the sidewalk until it disappeared into traffic. Across the street, the black sedan started its engine. It didn't follow the taxi. It followed Ivy's eyes. Cedric remained behind the wheel without moving. He had watched every minute of the appointment through the windshield. More importantly, he had watched Margaret walk out of the clinic smiling. That mattered. He reached for his phone again. This time Grant answered before the second ring. Cedric spoke only one sentence. She came out smiling. Grant didn't respond immediately. The silence lasted long enough for Cedric to hear traffic passing outside his own window. Finally, Grant asked a single question. Did Ivy ask about me? No. Another silence followed. Then the call ended. The rest of the afternoon passed more quickly than any day since the reopening. 2 fillings. 1 consultation. A child who cried before the examination and laughed before leaving. Ordinary moments slowly replaced extraordinary ones. Denise noticed it before Ivy did. People had stopped talking about Franklin as often. They had started talking about appointments instead. Which days were available, whether the clinic accepted their insurance, how soon a broken filling could be repaired. Those were the questions every real dental office wanted to hear. Just before closing, Denise finished entering the day's records into the computer. She compared the schedule for next week with the one they had opened only a few days earlier. Nearly half the available appointments had been filled. Not enough to call the clinic successful, more than enough to prove it wasn't failing. Ivy stood beside the front window, looking at the parking lot where the last patient had just driven away. For the first time since cutting the ribbon, she allowed herself to imagine what the clinic might look like 6 months later. Every chair occupied, every treatment room in use. Franklin walking through the front door and seeing the place alive again. The thought had barely settled before the reception phone rang. Denise answered with her usual greeting. Her expression changed almost immediately. She didn't interrupt the caller once. She simply listened, thanked them politely, and returned the receiver to its cradle. Ivy turned around. What happened? Denise looked down at the message she had written during the call. It contained only the name of a state agency and one sentence. We're receiving a formal inspection tomorrow morning. The clinic had survived patients leaving. It had survived rumors. It had survived empty days. Tomorrow, for the first time, someone with legal authority would walk through the front door. The inspectors arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, just before the first patient of the morning. 2 people stepped out of a state vehicle carrying clipboards instead of briefcases. Ivy greeted them outside the entrance before they reached the door. The older inspector introduced himself politely and handed her an official inspection notice. It wasn't a complaint or a suspension order. It was a routine compliance inspection authorized under state regulations. Ivy read the document, nodded once, and stepped aside. You're welcome to inspect anything you need for the next 2 hours. The inspectors moved methodically through every part of the clinic. Sterilization records, equipment maintenance logs, emergency supplies, patient documentation, and treatment protocols were all reviewed without interruption. Denise answered each question calmly while Ivy continued seeing patients whenever possible. Everything Franklin had insisted on documenting years ago had quietly become the foundation of the clinic again. Before leaving, the older inspector closed his folder and offered Ivy a courteous smile. Everything appears to be in order. You'll receive the official report in a few days. Denise waited until the front door closed behind them before letting out a slow breath. Ivy looked around the reception area, now filled with the ordinary sounds of another workday. Franklin Family Dental had just passed its first legal test without a single violation. 3 days passed before Ivy realized the inspection report still hadn't arrived. Patients continued returning, and the appointment book slowly filled with names instead of empty spaces. But every afternoon, Denise checked the mailbox expecting to find the official paperwork. On the 4th day, Ivy called the department herself. She only wanted to ask when the report would be mailed. The employee searched the inspection number, paused briefly, then apologized. According to our system, the report was finalized yesterday. Ivy frowned. We haven't received it. I'll email another copy right now. Less than a minute later, the document appeared in the clinic inbox. Ivy opened it while Denise stood beside her. Every section ended the same way, compliant. No deficiencies observed. Franklin Family Dental had passed without a single violation. Denise printed the report and slipped it into a frame near the reception desk where patients could see it while checking in. She stepped back, smiled quietly, and straightened the frame with one finger. It wasn't a trophy. It was simply proof that the clinic had earned the right to keep its doors open. Ivy looked at it for a moment before returning to her next patient. Rumors had spoken first. Now the official record could speak for itself. The framed inspection report remained on the reception wall for less than an hour before its first visitor stopped to read it. A middle-aged woman who had brought her teenage son for a consultation studied every line before turning back to Denise. She tapped the frame lightly with one finger. Is this the inspection everyone was talking about? Denise nodded. It is. The woman smiled, almost embarrassed. Then I owe your clinic an apology. She explained that she had canceled an appointment the week before after hearing Franklin Family Dental was under investigation. 2 days later, her family dentist had quietly told her the rumor wasn't true. He had also said something else. If you need someone who takes difficult cases seriously, he had told her, Franklin's daughter practices the same way her father did. Ivy overheard the last sentence while reviewing x-rays at the consultation desk. She looked up instinctively. The woman wasn't trying to flatter anyone. She was simply repeating what another dentist had said. Word had finally begun traveling in the opposite direction. Rumors had opened the story. Professional respect was beginning to answer them. Before leaving, the woman scheduled treatment for both herself and her son. Denise entered 2 new appointments into the computer, then quietly looked toward Ivy. Neither of them celebrated. It was still too early for that. But for the first time, a new patient had walked through the door because another dentist had recommended Franklin Family Dental. The inspection report lay open across Grant's desk before Cedric finished knocking. Every page carried the official seal of the state agency. Every section ended the same way: compliant. No deficiencies observed. Grant read the final page once more before closing the folder. There was no frustration in his expression. If anything, he looked relieved. Cedric noticed it immediately. The clinic passed. Grant nodded. I expected it would, Cedric hesitated. Then why request the inspection? Grant finally looked up. Because if the clinic had failed, patients could have been hurt. The answer came so naturally that Cedric didn't ask another question. Grant stood and walked toward the window overlooking downtown Denver. Nearly every clinic in his organization displayed the same inspection certificate Franklin Family Dental had just earned. Patient safety had never been a slogan to him. It was the reason Denver Dental Partners existed in the first place. Cedric broke the silence only once. The rumors aren't working anymore. Grant remained facing the city. Rumors never last. He paused. Truth does. Cedric waited. Should we stop? Grant slowly shook his head. No. His reflection remained fixed in the glass. We've spent 18 years protecting people from one mistake. Another quiet pause settled over the office. Now it's time Ivy learns why. The referral surprised Ivy enough that she began paying closer attention to the names appearing on new patient forms. Most came from former patients. A few came from neighbors. Then, late that afternoon, one referral stood out, referred by Dr. Michael Reeves. Ivy recognized the name immediately. Doctor. Reeves had practiced in Denver for more than 30 years and rarely referred patients unless he believed another dentist was the better choice. After the last patient left, Ivy called his office to thank him. She expected to leave a voicemail. Instead, he answered himself. I was wondering when you'd call, he said warmly. Ivy thanked him for the referral. Dr. Reeves gave a quiet laugh. I didn't send them because you're Franklin's daughter, he paused. I sent them because I remember the way Franklin practiced. The sentence stayed with Ivy. Did you know him well? Well enough to know he never rushed a difficult decision. There was a brief silence before he added, that was rare then, and it's still rare now. The call lasted only a few more minutes. Before hanging up, Doctor. Reeves left Ivy with one final thought. Take care of the patient sitting in your chair today. The truth has a way of catching up on its own. Ivy lowered the receiver slowly. She hadn't mentioned Franklin's reputation once during the conversation. She hadn't needed to. Some people had remembered it all along. The lights inside Grant's office remained on long after most of downtown had gone dark. A stack of operating reports rested untouched on his desk while the city reflected across the windows behind him. Cedric entered quietly, placed one final folder beside the others, and waited. Grant didn't open it. More referrals? He asked. 7 today? Cedric answered without looking down. Most came from former patients, a few from other dentists. Grant gave a slow nod. Nothing about the number surprised him anymore. Franklin Family Dental wasn't surviving because of sympathy. It was beginning to earn trust on its own. He walked to the window and stood there for several silent moments before speaking again. Do you know what troubles me? Cedric remained quiet. Every report says Ivy makes the same decisions Franklin used to make. Grant looked out across the lights of Denver. The careful ones? Another long silence settled over the room. For 18 years, he had believed those decisions had destroyed his family. Yet every new report arriving on his desk seemed to suggest the opposite. Ivy wasn't reckless. She wasn't chasing money. She was choosing caution even when it meant losing treatment. Grant slowly lowered his eyes. If she's practicing the same way, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The question had already formed in both their minds. If Ivy was doing exactly what Franklin would have done today, was it possible Franklin had done the right thing 18 years ago? Cedric waited, expecting another instruction. None came. Grant picked up his coat instead. For the first time since Franklin Family Dental reopened, he left the office carrying questions instead of plans. Friday mornings usually belong to emergencies: a chipped front tooth before a wedding, a child who woke up with a swollen cheek, a broken crown that couldn't wait until Monday. Franklin used to leave one appointment slot open every Friday because he believed pain never checked the calendar before arriving. Ivy had quietly kept the same habit without realizing it. Just after 10 o'clock, the reception phone rang. Denise answered, listened for nearly a minute, then slowly covered the receiver with one hand. "Emergency extraction," she said softly. Another clinic just referred him. Ivy reached for the patient's intake form before Denise finished speaking. The referral came from Dr. Reeves, a 72-year-old man. Severe pain around a partially erupted wisdom tooth. Facial swelling had begun overnight. Ivy looked at the attached panoramic X-ray the referring office had emailed a few moments earlier. She studied it for less than 10 seconds before setting it back down. The roots curved dangerously close to the inferior alveolar nerve. The image reminded her so much of Raymond's old X-ray that she looked at it a second time just to convince herself they weren't the same film. They weren't. Different patient, different jaw, the same difficult decision. The phone remained quiet while Ivy continued studying the image. Denise watched her without saying anything. She had seen Franklin stand exactly like that years ago, silent, focused, looking at an X-ray long enough that everyone around him became impatient. Ivy finally picked up the receiver. "Tell Harris I'll see him today," she paused. "But I won't be removing the tooth." Denise looked up. Ivy's eyes never left the X-ray. "He needs an oral surgeon with hospital privileges. I'll control the infection first." Denise smiled before she realized she was smiling. She had heard almost those exact words once before, 18 years earlier. Harris arrived carrying one side of his face in the palm of his hand. Every few minutes he stopped speaking long enough to catch his breath before the pain returned. Ivy completed the examination, reviewed the X-ray with him, and carefully explained why immediate extraction carried unusual risks. She pointed to the nerve canal. She explained how closely the roots wrapped around it. She described the difference between relieving the infection today and removing the tooth safely after additional imaging and surgical planning. Harris listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the X-ray for a long moment before asking only one question. "If I were your father, what would you tell me to do?" Ivy lowered the film from the viewing panel. She didn't answer immediately. Franklin had taught her never to rush the sentence patients remembered most. "I'd tell you the same thing I'm telling you now." She handed him the referral form she had already completed. "I'd rather lose a procedure than risk your smile." Harris folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Before leaving, he reached across the reception counter and shook Ivy's hand with surprising strength. "Then I'll go where you send me." 20 minutes later, he walked out carrying antibiotics, pain medication, and a referral instead of an extraction appointment. Ivy watched him drive away before returning to the treatment room. She never noticed the black SUV parked half a block away. Inside, Cedric lowered the camera resting on the dashboard. A short video had captured the entire consultation through the clinic window. He forwarded the recording without adding a single word. Less than a minute later, his phone vibrated. Grant had watched the video. The reply contained only one sentence. She made the same decision. The referral reached the oral surgery office before Harris did. Ivy had attached the X-rays, her examination notes, and a brief explanation of why she believed the extraction should be performed by an oral surgeon after additional imaging. Less than half an hour later, the clinic phone rang. Dr. Nathan Keller introduced himself and thanked Ivy for the detailed referral. They reviewed the X-ray together, discussing the position of the roots and the risk to the nearby nerve. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Before ending the call, Dr. Keller paused. Most dentists would have taken the case themselves. Ivy looked back at the illuminated X-ray. "I'd rather disappoint a patient for one day than change the rest of his life." Silence lingered briefly before Dr. Keller answered. Franklin used to think the same way. The call ended, but Ivy remained standing in front of the viewing panel for another moment. She hadn't mentioned her father once. She hadn't needed to. Another dentist had recognized him through a single decision. Grant watched the consultation video only once. He never replayed recordings. By the time Cedric entered the office, the tablet had already been switched off and placed face down on the desk. Neither man mentioned the patient. Neither mentioned the referral. They both understood what mattered wasn't the treatment. It was the decision behind it. Grant walked toward the bookshelf, lining the far wall, and stopped in front of a framed newspaper clipping that had remained there for years. The headline had faded slightly with age, but the photograph beneath it hadn't. The young woman was still smiling. 18 years had changed almost everything except that smile. Cedric remained silent. Grant finally spoke without turning around. Franklin made the same decision. Cedric nodded once. So did Ivy. The office fell quiet again. Grant continued looking at the newspaper. For 18 years, he had believed one thing with complete certainty. Franklin's decision had destroyed his family. Yet the woman reopening Franklin Family Dental had just made exactly the same decision for a stranger she had never met. Not because anyone forced her. Not because she knew someone was watching. She had done it because she believed it was the safest choice. Grant slowly lowered his eyes. For the first time in 18 years, a question entered his mind before anger did. If Franklin had been right then, what had really happened that day? Monday morning began with a phone call Ivy hadn't expected. The number belonged to Dr. Keller's office. She answered while reviewing the day's first chart, expecting another question about Harris. Instead, the oral surgeon got straight to the point. The surgery went well. Ivy quietly closed the patient file in front of her and listened. Doctor. Keller explained that the CB-CT scan had confirmed exactly what Ivy had suspected. The roots wrapped around the inferior alveolar nerve more closely than the original panoramic X-ray had shown. Removing the tooth had required sectioning it into several smaller pieces before lifting each fragment individually. The procedure had taken nearly twice as long as a routine extraction. The nerve remained intact. Harris had already regained normal sensation in his lower lip before leaving the recovery room. Ivy thanked him before ending the call. She didn't celebrate. She simply returned the receiver to its cradle and stood quietly for a moment. One careful decision had ended with an ordinary Monday morning. No headlines, no investigations, no grieving family. Just another patient going home safely. Denise noticed the change in Ivy's expression before she heard the news. "Everything okay?" Ivy nodded. "The surgery was successful." Denise smiled softly. "Good." Then, almost without thinking, she added, "That's exactly how your father always wanted difficult cases to end." Neither woman spoke again. They didn't need to. Sometimes the best outcome in dentistry was the one nobody ever talked about. Grant unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk for the first time in months. Inside lay a single patient file bound by a faded blue cover. Time had yellowed the paper along the edges, but the handwriting across the front remained easy to read. He carried the file back to his desk and opened it slowly. The first page contained copies of old medical records. The second held consent forms. Farther inside rested an X-ray he had seen countless times over the past 18 years. He knew every shadow on the film by memory, every curve of the roots, every date written across the corner. Yet this time he didn't stop at the X-ray. He kept turning pages. Consultation notes, laboratory reports, hospital records, newspaper clippings carefully preserved between plastic sleeves. Then his hand stopped. Tucked between two documents lay a referral recommendation written by another dentist before the surgery took place. Grant had read the page years earlier. He had never looked at it twice. Today he did. The recommendation was short. The patient should receive additional imaging. The case should be evaluated by an oral surgeon before extraction. Grant read the paragraph again, then a third time. The words felt strangely familiar. Not because of the handwriting, because only 3 days earlier he had watched Ivy make almost the same recommendation for Harris. Grant slowly closed the file without finishing it. The room remained completely silent. 18 years had taught him to remember one ending. For the first time, he found himself wondering whether he had forgotten the beginning. Grant didn't reopen the file that afternoon. Instead, he drove across Denver without telling Cedric where he was going. The city moved through the windshield in familiar pieces. Downtown buildings gave way to older neighborhoods. New shopping centers disappeared behind streets lined with houses that had stood there long before Denver Dental Partners existed. Nearly 40 minutes later, he stopped in front of a small brick home he hadn't visited in years. The paint had faded. The maple tree in the front yard had grown tall enough to shade half the roof. Everything else looked almost exactly as it had 18 years earlier. Grant remained behind the steering wheel without getting out. This had been the last place his sister had smiled without pain. The last place she had insisted the swelling would probably disappear in a day or two. He remembered every conversation from that week, every argument around the dinner table, every promise that things would be fine after one simple procedure. For 18 years, those memories had always ended in the same place, the surgery. Today, for the first time, another memory forced its way in before that ending. A dentist studying an X-ray longer than anyone else thought necessary. A quiet recommendation to wait. A referral instead of a treatment. Grant closed his eyes. He couldn't remember Franklin's exact words anymore, only that his sister had come home disappointed because the tooth hadn't been removed. At the time, Grant had been angry with Franklin for sending her away still in pain. 18 years later, he found himself asking a question he had never allowed before. What if sending her home had been the safest decision anyone made that week? The following morning, Ivy unlocked the clinic before sunrise. Denise was already preparing the treatment rooms when a referral request appeared in the clinic inbox. It came from a dental office across town. The case wasn't urgent, but the referring dentist wanted a second opinion before beginning treatment. Ivy opened the attached X-ray and studied it quietly before calling the patient herself. She didn't offer an extraction or promise immediate treatment. Instead, she scheduled a consultation for later that afternoon. Denise noticed the change immediately. Another referral? Ivy nodded. Just one. She looked back at the X-ray. Sometimes one careful opinion is all a patient needs. The consultation ended exactly as she expected. After reviewing the imaging and completing her examination, Ivy recommended additional evaluation instead of rushing into treatment. The patient thanked her before leaving with a referral in hand rather than an appointment for the procedure he thought he needed. It wasn't the kind of decision that made headlines. It was the kind that quietly built trust. Late that afternoon, Cedric placed a single referral report on Grant's desk. Another dentist sent a patient to Franklin Family Dental, he said. Grant looked at the page for several seconds before closing the folder again. A week earlier, he might have dismissed it as coincidence. Now it felt like the beginning of something else. He stood, reached for his coat, and turned toward the door. Cedric looked up. "Where are you going?" Grant answered without slowing his pace. "To ask someone a question I've waited 18 years to ask." Grant didn't drive toward downtown. He didn't head for another Denver Dental Partners clinic. He crossed the city in the opposite direction, leaving the business district behind until the streets grew quieter and the houses farther apart. Cedric sat in the passenger seat without asking where they were going. He recognized the route only after the car passed an old church near the edge of West Denver. Grant hadn't driven this road in nearly 18 years, yet he never looked at a map. Every turn came from memory. The SUV finally slowed in front of a modest one-story house hidden behind two aging pine trees. The white paint had faded long ago. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. Wind chimes hanging from the porch moved gently in the afternoon breeze. Nothing about the house suggested the man living there had once been one of Denver's most respected dentists. Grant left the engine running but didn't get out immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the front porch. "How long has he been here?" Cedric opened the folder resting on his lap. "Almost 14 years. Grant nodded slowly. 14 years. Franklin hadn't disappeared. He had simply stepped out of a profession he no longer believed he deserved. Grant reached for the door handle, then stopped. For 18 years, he had imagined this meeting hundreds of different ways. In every version, anger spoke first. Today, for the first time, anger had nothing ready to say. The front door opened before Grant reached the porch. An older man stepped outside carrying a small watering can. His hair had turned completely gray, and his shoulders no longer carried the straight posture Ivy remembered from childhood. But the way he paused before walking down the steps hadn't changed at all. Franklin always looked carefully before moving forward, whether he was crossing a room or making a decision that could change someone's life. He noticed the black SUV first, then Cedric. Finally, Grant. Neither man spoke. The distance between them measured no more than 20 feet. 18 years fit comfortably inside it. Franklin set the watering can beside the porch without taking his eyes off Grant. There was no surprise on his face. Only the quiet expression of someone who had known this day would eventually arrive. Grant stood beside the driver's door with both hands resting at his sides. The questions that had followed him for nearly 2 decades suddenly felt heavier than the anger that had carried them. Franklin broke the silence first. "You've grown older." Grant gave the smallest nod. "So have you." The wind moved gently through the pine trees, carrying the faint scent of fresh-cut grass across the yard. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a lawnmower started in the distance. Ordinary sounds filled a moment that neither man had imagined would ever feel ordinary. Franklin looked toward the house behind him before returning his eyes to Grant. "Would you like to come inside?" Grant didn't answer immediately. He looked at the man he had blamed for nearly half his life. Then he thought about Ivy standing over Harris's X-ray, refusing to rush a decision that might change someone forever. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than Cedric had ever heard. "I came because I need you to tell me exactly what happened that day." Franklin held his gaze for several long seconds before slowly nodding once. "Then you should hear everything." He stepped aside from the doorway. Grant walked toward the porch. For the first time in 18 years, neither of them was running from the past anymore.